Exciting news. I have a new 3D printed 48 slot auto knitter cylinder, and this movie is about preparing it for its first use, installing it, and trying it out. The positions for the bolts that hold the cylinder in place are present, but they have to be tapped. You just saw Jack do that. And then we found there were some tiny plastic crumbs, and it was the best idea to gently smooth the cylinder spring area and each slot to make sure that the needles would slide smoothly. After that, the cylinder installed in exactly the usual manner. We popped on the needle retainer, did a little lubrication, and it is worth noting that you wouldn't necessarily use the same lubricants for 3D printed stuff as you do for the old steel cylinders. We're using silicone. Now just a few needles to see if they seem to respond normally, and yay, they do. So I cast on using the spiral tool that you've seen in another movie, and then gradually added more and more needles into work. I've sped some of this up, but this whole time, of course, we're cranking slowly and carefully so as to observe. I plan to order large hook needles, which will be much more suitable to the yarns that will work on this cylinder. But they are not here, so I'm using my regular standard gauge hook size needles. They are in fact knitting quite well, but you will see some mistakes as the needles have trouble handling yarn of these weights. At present, I'm not overly worried about that. The goal for today is to try out different yarns, test the performance of the cylinder, which so far is very good, and get the feel of appropriate stitch adjustments. I'm referring to size adjustments, and off camera, or tweaking the size from time to time. Most of these yarns are taking pretty close to the largest stitches that the dial can adjust to make. Next, I knitted a heel. This isn't a real sock, it's a test of the heel making technique, and it went fine, but I did engage the heel spring as one usually does, and I later decided that that was the wrong thing to do. It makes the stitches noticeably smaller to the point that they were difficult for the machine to knit off and change the gauge, and are tighter than I would actually want the sock heel to be. So I knitted a second test with different yarn and did not engage the heel spring. Instead, I removed the slack at the end or the beginning of every row with a manual twitch with my fingertips, and I was much more pleased with the results. If this were a real sock, this would be the sock top, and where I engaged the heel spring, you can see a definite gauge change. For this one, I left that heel spring engaged going down the foot. I confess that was an accident, but I did not like it at all, and it was very difficult knitting. That sample was Mary Lou's Liberty Plus. The next sample is Patton's Astra, which says right on its sport weight, so nowadays we'd call it a number 2. But it's a pretty robust example of the number 2 range, really approaching number 3. And here's that sample. For this one, I did not use the heel spring. I simply removed the slack yarn by hand and knitted back in the other direction while short rowing in and then out. It gave very nice results and an even stitch size throughout. This yarn rendered a tube that would fit my foot and lots of ladies' feet, about 8 inches around. This sample, the dark blue, is the Tam Nordic yarn, which I would say is the high end of number 3 or the low end of number 4. And then the vintage multicolored yarn is definitely a worsted rate number 4. These make tubes that are greater in circumference and going to be more suitable for male feet. So if you like acrylic socks, I think any of the yarns that I have demonstrated with here could be used. We prefer wool socks, so I'm looking for appropriate wool yarns, and as soon as I have those and my large hook needles in hand, I will be back with patterns.